Some people suffer from the symptoms of IBS without having a clinical diagnosis of IBS, right? So it can be quite mild or moderate to all the way through to the far end of the spectrum. You can have very severe IBS, which really does control everything. People structure their daily routines around access to bathrooms. It's just miserable.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Today, I'm interviewing Duncan McLaren. He's the CEO of Greenspace Labs, which is doing some pretty interesting stuff in the cannabinoid space. And he's going to tell us all about what he's up to and how the company is potentially going to revolutionize the way we look at irritable bowel syndrome. Thanks, Duncan, for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What is your background and how did you get into the space of looking at cannabinoids for medical treatment?
Yeah, so this is maybe what I would consider an atypical journey. So I originally did my undergrad back in the UK. My undergrad was marine biology and oceanography, and at that time you're kind of like, well, Brennan, what are you going to do with that? Turns out there's not a lot of opportunities in marine biology in the UK. Um, so, I did some entrepreneurial things in the UK, and then I sort of came to a fork in my career, and I decided to decide what I was going to do there. And I had one option to go to medical school, which I got a place at medical school in the UK, or a place to go to business school. So I ended up going down the business school path, for better or for worse. And that led me out here to the US, where I started actually in technology. And so most of my career I've actually been in technology. So you may think this is actually a fairly unpromising start to be getting into life sciences. In around 2014, I co-founded a company with a couple of the country's top gastroenterologists. It's a digital health company called My Total Health, My GI Health. Through that work, I learned a great deal about the entire spectrum of GI disorders. So everything from IBS, IBD, along with the other myriad of disorders that you can encounter. And working with the gastroenterologists, I had a wonderful exposure to everything from clinical research through to, submitting manuscripts for papers and so on. One of the areas that we lent into was recruitment for clinical trials, patient recruitment for clinical trials. And so I ended up being able to review a lot of the protocols for clinical trials. One of the interesting elements was that every single clinical trial, bar none, for any GI disorder, one of the exclusionary criteria was the patient could not be taking any medical cannabis, any CBD, medical or recreational or otherwise. So you go, that's an interesting. And you start wondering, well, why is that? Well, you peel back the layers and it turns out, well, it starts to interfere with the results of the study. What does that mean? So you start peeling it back a little bit further, and it turns out that tends to have a positive impact on GI disorders. So that's sort of the first light bulb going off. It's like something is going on here. And clearly, it's recognized by a lot of the researchers in the GI space. Now you do sort of adjacent research and you figure out, well, why are we not learning more about this? With my work for my GI health, IBS, for example, is a very widespread disease. About 15% of the US population suffers from IBS. It represents about 50% of all of visits to a gastroenterology's office. And it's one of these very hard to treat diseases. It's often considered a diagnosis by exclusion. So you have to exclude all of the other potential culprits before you get a diagnosis of IBS. So that means excluding things like inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, food allergies, food intolerances, and so on. So you can go through, if you're very rigorous about this, you can go through and do months and months of tests to rule out all of the other options until you come up with a not particularly satisfactory diagnosis of IBS. So at that point, it's then, well, what do you do? Now, if you know anyone who's sort of suffered from IBS, it's one of those diseases that can really quite severely impact the quality of your life. So it can go from everything from quite mild, it's definitely a spectrum, through to some people suffer from the symptoms of IBS without having a clinical diagnosis of IBS, right? So it can be quite mild or moderate, to all the way through to the far end of the spectrum, where you can have very severe IBS, which really does control everything. People structure their daily routines around access to bathrooms. It's just miserable. And there are some good prescription treatments for those at the severe end of the spectrum, but they do come with side effects. Now, for the vast majority of people who are not at that severe end of the spectrum, what are your options? Well, you've got a handful over-the-counter treatments that treat sort of one symptom for a short period of time. So pain, analgesia, antidiarrheals, laxatives, that's about it. So there's very little options between the over-the-counter options through to prescription. There's a big sort of unmet need in the sort of space for patients.
So what brought you to sort of explore this from a clinical perspective beyond just, working with the GI company? Because now obviously Greenspace Labs is a totally different company. So what brought you from that company to Greenspace Labs, and how did you guys start exploring the use of cannabinoids in this space specifically?
I think one of the triggers, one of the really important stories, is an anecdotal story that I heard. It was a friend of mine's nephew. She was explaining he'd been diagnosed with IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, which is a much more severe
Hmm.
GI disorder, and frequently, it can be treated with surgery to remove parts of your GI tract, right? So he was a high school student, standout athlete on track to go to have a scholarship to college. But he started getting these terrible abdominal pains, and he was diagnosed with IBD at about age 15, 16. He was on the sort of standard treatments, which include immunosuppressants, and anti-inflammatories and antibiotics. They weren't working for him. So 17, 18, the doctor said, look, we think that the best option for you is surgery. We want to remove part of your GI tract, give you a colostomy bag. For a 17, 18-year-old kid who just thinks he's going to go to sports scholarship to college, that's devastating.
Hmm.
So to his credit, he went out to do his own research, and he found a community of IBD sufferers that had figured out that they can brew a tea using marijuana, that would alleviate symptoms, but without leaving him feeling inebriated or incapacitated in any way. So he actually made a pretty rapid recovery. The doctors took surgery off the table. He was eventually able to go on to college, compete at college level in middle distance running, and he basically had a full recovery. Now, to me, that was a pretty incredible story. So I'm thinking here, the crime here is not that people are taking cannabis or THC, is the fact that we haven't been able to study this. It's great that someone has had relief, but that required that person to take the initiative, and what works for that person may not work for the next person. We need an evidence-based approach to develop therapeutics. So taking these sort of two pieces together, um, I've been in contact with other friends who had been working on and in the THC, in the marijuana space. I was like, I'd always been looking for a way to access and do something there. And with these two data points, I was like, I need to take advantage of this. So that's where I joined Greenspace. I turned directed the company more away from being a testing company, more into investigating the therapeutic potential for cannabinoids. Um, and how we got to IBS and kind of where we are today is we were working with one of the country's top integrative practice medical doctors. And she's been treating patients for the last 20 plus years, based in New York.
So I'm assuming this doctor is a GI specialist. Is she an MD, or what are her credentials?
Yeah, she's an MD, but she's not a GI specialist. She's a generalist, but she's been working with cannabinoids and treating patients for many years. And she actually was receiving referrals from patients from places like NYU, Syracuse, and other Cornell. And gastroenterologists, amongst others, were referring patients to her who were resistant to standard treatments. So we're focused specifically on IBS and GI. So that's where I wanted to focus our research. And we collected some of her data, her anecdotal data. We found a cohort of 225 patients that she treated between 2018 and 2020. And over a period of a 3-month treatment program, we sort of were able to follow those patients through from initial consultation through to taking the cannabinoid treatment. And the state of New York has a really interesting medical marijuana program where practitioners are able to see when patients actually take down the prescriptions. So based upon that, we saw through her data that she had more than 80% of the patients saw dramatic improvements in their symptoms after this treatment program. So that's why we were thinking, okay, this is a direction that we really need to go down, right? So we've got a multiple data points pointing to really something that should have clinical significance. And again, we are aware that there's the placebo effect. And there's a really interesting theory that actually the placebo effect may actually be a result of your endocannabinoid system. That's another story altogether. What is needed is the evidence to start developing the therapeutics. So we've got real world observational data. Now we need to go into clinical trials. So that's kind of where we are today. The observational data points to the fact that we can use cannabinoids that are non-psychoactive, meaning they do not contain THC. And that's fairly significant because there's still a lot of regulatory barriers with regard to research using THC. And in fact, we're actually starting a study in Europe using the minor cannabinoids.
So obviously, since this is a GI product, you must have some gastroenterologists that are advising or helping you out with the product.
Yeah, that's right. So having worked in the GI space for a number of years prior to this, I was able to leverage those relationships. So I've got the benefit of working with a couple of actually the country's top gastroenterologists who've been helping and advising us. So one, he's probably been involved with 3/4 of all of the clinical trials with regard to IBS over the last 20 years. It's his advice. So our study in Poland is a small, what we call pilot study. And it was his suggestion that rather than going to a full 400-person study that we'd really need to take to the FDA for the amount of clinical evidence that we will need, he suggested, look, why don't you do a small 40, 50-person study, call it a pilot study, just to look for the signal of efficacy. Because if you can see that signal in that small patient population, then you'll have a lot easier time finding partners and investors to help fund the next stage. So we took that advice to heart, and that's why we've sort of architected a small study in Europe to do that. And yes, we do benefit from a lot of very, very good gastroenterologists who are helping us in this space.
And when will you know the results of that study, the Poland one?
Well, we should be starting within the next month or two. And then it should be a fairly rapid enrollment. So we think that this will be fully enrolled within 6 months. So we'll have data shortly thereafter.
So can you explain a little bit about the difference between THC and the cannabinoid class? Because I don't really understand the entire difference between it. And also, if within that, you can also talk a little bit about how they might be regulated differently in this country.
The cannabis plant, there's a whole range of cannabinoids. A couple of the most well-known ones, there's THC and CBD, which you should have heard of. In addition to that, there are maybe over 90 minor cannabinoids. There are some of the others which you may again have heard of, CBN, CBG, CBDA, etc. And they go on, and we're still learning more about that. THC, the most famous one, is known for its psychoactive properties. So it is the THC in marijuana that gives you the high. So that makes you feel inebriated. It also has it is thought to have other medical properties too. The minor cannabinoids, so CBD and others, They are not psychoactive. So what I mean by that is there is no associated high with taking them, but they do have a very significant biological effect on the body, and we can sort of map that through the metabolic pathways. Now, there is something also referred to as the entourage effect that people talk about, where if you combine more, one or more cannabinoids together, that they actually work in tandem together and actually produce an amplified effect. So that's why we're actually working with several cannabinoids in our formulation for IBS because they do slightly different things. So CBN, for example, has an effect. It's supposed to enhance sleep. CBD, when you take it with THC, tends to reduce the psychoactive component of THC. So that's another important sort of component to this when you start thinking about products that combine THC and CBD. Then CBG, which is considered to be the mother, if you like, the parent molecule for all of these others. You can basically create all of the other cannabinoids from CBG. So it's thought to have a pretty important role. Again, but there's a lot of research that needs to be done, and there's still a lot to learn about this sort of whole class.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button below. It not only helps the channel, but it helps all the people and the companies that we interview here. Thanks for watching. Yeah, it's super interesting because I know when me and you had initially connected, I was really fascinated by what you guys were doing at Greenspace because I'm a glaucoma physician, and we know that cannabinoids have a effect on eye pressure lowering, and it's a question that I get very commonly in my office that, should I be taking marijuana? Should I be using this to help with my glaucoma? And my standard response, which I've rehearsed 100 times, is, there's not really great studies on it, and so it's not something that I can really recommend to you as someone who needs to recommend evidence-based medicine. And I don't say, okay, absolutely not, don't touch it. I say, it's just not something that I'm really comfortable giving my professional recommendation on. And it's not something at this point that has a formulation that is proven to make a difference, or that would ever, at this point, at this point would make me change the other medications that you take. Like, you still need to be on these other medications to control your glaucoma. And so it's just a really fascinating space because if we can get, like you mentioned, if you can get into clinical trials that can prove the efficacy and that can standardize it, I mean, that's really powerful for people to have another class of medication across IBS, across glaucoma, and I'm sure that there's other diseases out there that could benefit. But it's all about the evidence. It's all about the right formulation. It's about standardization, and those are not things that are easy to accomplish.
That's right. So it's interesting that you say that. I have a couple of my cousins. I have four cousins. Two of them ended up being gastroenterologists.
Yeah.
So I've had a lot of conversations with them over the years. And it's funny that the conversation you have with your patients is very similar to the conversations that they have with their patients. They have patients come to them and say, "Hey, doc, look, should I be taking, or is it okay if I take medical marijuana? Is it going to help me? Is it going to hurt me, et cetera, et cetera?" And their standard response is, "Look, actually, this has just recently changed, but historically they said they haven't been able to talk about or discuss benefits or pros and cons of medical marijuana with their patients. That has actually recently changed, which is good. But there's not that much really good evidence-based clinical work for them to refer to. And then thirdly, there's this huge variety of different products that are available. Without the lack of sort of standardizations that you would have for standard prescription products or over-the-counter products, you don't know what they're taking. And that's a real problem because there is no compunction on behalf of manufacturers to even keep the product the same from one batch to the next. They can change the formulation, they can change that. And the quality controls aren't the same as you would have if you're producing, either a prescription product or a product for over the counter. So those are all serious problems. And to your point, if I have some success with a particular cannabis product for glaucoma or whatever it might be, and I recommend it to a friend, and they say, "Great, well, I tried it, but it didn't work for me." Well, what happened? Well, you don't know what the product was, how much they were taking, when they were taking it, what was contained in the product. So you don't know the dosing. It's just not standardized, and that is a problem. So it's for all of these reasons, we need some standards for the medical community to get behind and embrace any cannabinoid treatment for any particular indication. We need some standards. We need the evidence for you as a physician to be able to help your patients and say, yes, I can say that this product is worth trying. There's some good clinical evidence here, and I can recommend this product because it is standard. I know what's in it, and patients have taken it before and they've had some success. The one thing that I will say is that on the whole, any cannabinoid product, notwithstanding how they've been manufactured, but should be fairly safe. So that is one thing that is going for it. The body tolerates cannabinoids very well. We actually have an endocannabinoid system in our own body. And the endocannabinoid system is complementary to the cannabinoids that are made by plants, the phytocannabinoids. And that's sort of part of the reason why there is a really significant biological impact when you consume cannabinoids. It's also why it's safe, because our body recognizes them and it can digest them well and metabolize them well. And it is also the reason why it potentially has impact across a wide range of different disease states, everything from sleep, weight, anxiety, emotional state, through to GI disorders, through to glaucoma, through to inflammatory responses, and so on. It seems like a very wide, broad range of different responses to consuming cannabinoids, and I believe they're all legitimate, but they do need to be studied in and of themselves. Not everyone has the same experience and response to cannabinoids. So,
Given all the things that you mentioned about the standardization and quality control, do you guys see yourself going down an FDA like pathway for being a prescription drug, or do you see yourself more in the supplement category? And how are you guys sort of making that decision?
yeah, so we were really had a decision to make. Either we go down the supplement pathway or we go down the FDA regulated pathway. So with the supplement pathway, we can put a product together, we can take it to market, and we can sell it, right? Barriers to entry pretty low. What is the problem there? Well, the problem today is that there are lots of supplements out there, right, that contain CBD. And you can lotions, tonics, what have you. You can get them at your local grocery store. You can get them at your drugstore. But you can't, you can only make generalized health claims like this improves your GI health or something along those lines. What we want to do is create a product that the medical community can get behind, because we believe that there is a large unmet need for more treatment options for IBS patients. So understanding that, and understanding that, there are very few barriers to entry to create a supplement, but you can't make those health claims, is fairly easy for us to say, well, I think the right thing to do, it's not the easy thing, but the right thing to do. This is a long, hard path because you need to do all the preclinical work, you need to do the clinical work, and you need the evidence. And then you need to be able to present that to the FDA. And all this is going down what's referred as an IND, or an investigational new drug pathway. And then you present that evidence to the FDA, and they say, they will approve you to do a clinical trial, et cetera, et cetera. And then hopefully you get the results that you want, and you can then take that to market. So that is the pathway that we're going down. We're pursuing an IND pathway with the FDA. What that will do is then be like any other drug, whether it's over the counter or prescription, that we can say this is specifically indicated for the treatment of IBS. In fact, if you're going down the over the counter pathway, we can't talk about IBS symptoms, actually, which is an interesting point. But as a prescription drug, you certainly talk about IBS. In Europe, you can buy over-the-counter drugs that talk about symptoms associated with IBS. and you'll see products that say this is treats sort of abdominal cramping associated with IBS, for example. In the US, you cannot.
So obviously going down the FDA pathway is not inexpensive. How have you guys been tackling some of the costs associated with that as the company?
Yeah, so as you say, not an inexpensive proposition. So with part of the reason why we're starting our clinical studies are in Europe is one is that in actually in Poland specifically, one is that the research costs are about 1/3 of the costs here in the US. So that's reason one. And reason two is that they've been the grant system there is appears to be a little bit more generous right now. Um, and it benefits from a lot of EU money. So they're trying to, ramp up uh, research and so on in Poland specifically. So we've been a beneficiary of that, and we established actually a Polish entity with a Polish team that we have running the clinical trials. And we're also applying for larger grants as well to do more preclinical work for sort of other formulations. So it's one pathway that we're going down. Here in the US, we're still working with private investors.
Yeah, so I know that you're fundraising. Is there a way that someone watching this, if they're interested in investing, how do they get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Yeah, email Greenspace. My name is Duncan McLaren, so at Greenspace Labs. I can share the information with you. So
Yeah, I'll flash it across the screen for anyone who's watching. So can you tell me a little bit more about the regulatory system in the US when it comes to cannabinoids and medical cannabis?
yeah, so this is one of the most challenging parts, I think, of working within the cannabinoid space here in the US. So as you probably are aware, the US today, federally, marijuana is not legal. However, on a state-by-state basis, 40 states that have approved medical use cannabis exceptions, and I think 19 for recreational use. In a practical sense, what does that mean? So one of the problems, if we were to create a THC containing product, and assuming that we don't follow an FDA approval pathway for it, which is, and now we're starting to get into a gray area because there are one or two FDA approved THC containing products. But as we discussed before, it's a long and expensive pathway. Um, we cannot take that particular product across state lines. So that is hugely challenging. So if you find the right partner with the right manufacturing facilities who can meet your quality control requirements, ideally this would be all done in an FDA certified lab environment that would meet GMP standards or good manufacturing standards. But they just don't exist in every single state. And it's impractical to set up manufacturing in different states for those sorts of facilities because you just don't benefit from scale because you're only distributing within the state.
Yeah, so what are you gonna do?
Well, that creates a real problem. Now we're just actually about to launch a product within a state to treat chronic pain. And this is really important because there's an opioid epidemic in the US, as I'm sure you're aware. Um, and that is being fueled by, people with chronic pain, and people build up a tolerance to opioids and then create a dependency. Cannabinoids, while this is not going to be a solution to that, people who start taking cannabinoids, primarily THC containing products, when they're on opioids, they tend to start to reduce, they kind of stop the tolerance building for the opioids. And it starts to counteract some of that piece. Patients don't necessarily come off opioids entirely to be replaced with THC, but as an adjunctive therapy to alongside opioids, it's twofold benefit. One is you stop getting the resistance to the opioids, and two, you start to have additional or increased therapeutic benefit from the THC when you combine it. So that's a sort of a really important kind of thing here. Now, as it relates to how do we start to, commercialize that, We're doing a pilot in one state, and we're going to see how that goes. And if that works, we can be selective in finding partners in other states who may be able to meet the certain quality control requirements that we'll have, and license the formulation into other states. So it's challenging, but we do want to position ourselves as and when deregulation comes. And the administration has currently talked about rescheduling from Schedule 4, which puts cannabis on a par with heroin, um, to reschedule it to a Schedule 3 drug, which is alongside of ketamine. That it's unclear how that's going to happen and when, but it will change over time. There's a general acceptance that cannabinoids are here and here to stay. They're generally fairly, any drug can be abused, but they're generally, compared to other over-the-counter or prescription drugs, are relatively safe. So, we need to figure out a way to work within the regulatory environment that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You can drink too much alcohol and that could be catastrophic for you. You could take a bottle of acetaminophen and, not
All
wake
right.
up the next day. So another question I have is why not start in Europe if that is sort of where things are a little easier?
That's a good question. While we've got our clinical study going on in Europe, if you think of Europe similar to the States, it's a lot of different countries there. While there is an overall European Drug Agency, the different countries all have their own rules and regulations with regard to THC. So in Poland, we can't put THC into a human in a clinical trial, but we can in Holland, for example.
Okay.
So it in many ways is just as challenging in Europe as it is in the US.
And do you feel like if something is approved or has made it through the rigorous FDA process, it makes it easier to get into than other countries?
Yes. Yeah. If we're able to get an FDA approval, there is something called a 505(b)(2) pathway, I believe, that allows us to take all of the clinical evidence that we have gathered together to get it approved by the FDA into other administrations for sure.
Thanks so much for being here. I'd love to do a follow-up in maybe a year or so if you're open to it and seeing where Greenspace is at. And I really appreciate your time.